My attorney smiled, slid a will across the conference table, and congratulated me on updating my estate after my hospital stay. I read the signature once. Then I looked at the title typed beneath my name. It identified me as Major Milton Graves. I had retired from the Air Force as a lieutenant colonel more than 30 years earlier. When I asked to compare it with the original will my wife and I signed together, my attorney quietly closed the folder and said we could always do that another day. That was the moment I realized the document in front of me wasn't merely unexpected. It didn't belong in my life at all. If you've ever trusted someone's reputation more than your own memory, stay with me. Richard Nolan had managed my family's legal affairs for nearly 20 years. He drafted the trust my wife and I created after she was diagnosed with cancer. He attended her memorial service. He shook my hand afterward and promised he would always protect the plans we had made together. That history made what happened next feel almost impossible. He tapped the closed folder gently. You approved these revisions during your hospital stay last spring. I did? You probably don't remember. Recovery can be difficult. His explanation sounded calm, reasonable, professional. But administration had been my career long before retirement. The Air Force taught me that documents rarely fail because of dramatic mistakes. They fail because one ordinary detail refuses to agree with everything around it. I looked at him again. Would you mind showing me the earlier copy? Today? If it's convenient. Richard smiled politely. I've already returned the archived file to storage. We can compare them next week. Interesting. For 20 years, he never hesitated to retrieve old paperwork whenever I asked. Today, the one document I wanted most had suddenly become unavailable. I nodded slowly. Perhaps my memory isn't what it used to be. His shoulders relaxed almost immediately. I wouldn't worry. I've seen this happen before. Maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't. Either way, I had no intention of arguing inside his conference room. Instead, I asked for a few days to think. I'd like some time to remember the hospital conversations. Of course. Take all the time you need. As he gathered the papers, one page briefly slipped sideways. For only a second, I saw the beneficiary section. My estranged stepson Daniel's name appeared where my wife's Veterans Scholarship Foundation had always been listed. Then Richard calmly closed the folder again. I thanked him for his patience. He thanked me for trusting him. Neither statement felt entirely honest. Driving home, I stopped beside the small lake where my wife and I used to eat lunch every anniversary. Inside the glove compartment rested the fountain pen she gave me after my Air Force retirement ceremony. For years, we signed every important family document with that pen. I held it for several quiet moments before returning it to its case. Not because I needed comfort. Because routines help separate emotion from evidence. The wrong military rank bothered me. The missing original will bother me more. But one question refused to leave my mind. If Richard truly believed I had approved those changes during my hospital stay, why had he seemed so determined to keep me from reading the only document that could immediately prove whether either of us was remembering the truth? I spent the rest of that afternoon doing something Richard Nolan probably never expected. Nothing. At least nothing visible. I drove home, watered the flowers my wife used to care for, fed the birds outside the kitchen window. Then I unlocked the small cedar cabinet where we kept every important family paper from the past 40 years. People often assume an Air Force administrator spends a career pushing paperwork. The truth is simpler. You learn that records preserve memory long after confidence begins to fade. My wife used to tease me because I dated everything. Letters, receipts, trust amendments, holiday cards. Even the instruction booklet for the fountain pen she gave me at retirement. That habit suddenly became useful. Inside one archive box rested every estate document Richard had ever mailed us. The earliest trust draft. Annual review letters. Billing statements. Appointment reminders. Nothing looked unusual until I reached an envelope dated 6 months before my hospital stay. Richard's cover letter addressed me exactly as he always had. Lieutenant Colonel Milton Graves. Correct, professional, consistent. I opened the next year's correspondence. Same title. Another review notice. Same wording. Then I found a photocopy of the document Richard claimed I approved during my hospitalization. Major Milton Graves. Wrong rank. Wrong decade. Not a simple typo. Richard had represented my family for almost 20 years. He attended my retirement celebration. He signed legal paperwork identifying me correctly dozens of times. He didn't suddenly forget my military history. Someone copied information from somewhere much older. That evening, I located the hospital discharge binder my granddaughter Claire helped organize after my surgery. Every visitor had signed the reception log. Family, neighbors, physical therapist, church friends. No attorney. Interesting. The following morning, I called the hospital records office. I'm reviewing paperwork from last spring. The clerk politely confirmed that visitors were required to sign in throughout my recovery because the orthopedic wing remained under restricted access. Would legal appointments appear there? Yes, sir. If they occurred in your room. I thanked her and ended the call. Not proof, but another quiet contradiction. Richard insisted I approved the revised will during my hospitalization. The hospital maintained visitor records. My personal binder contained none. The receptionist confirmed such visits should have been documented. 3 independent timelines. 1 explanation. None of them agreed. Before lunch, I received a voicemail from Richard. Milton, I hope you remembered everything. We can finalize your estate revisions whenever you're comfortable. Interesting. He wasn't asking whether I wanted to compare the wills anymore. He wanted the revisions completed. Driving to the grocery store later that afternoon, I passed the small public library where my wife volunteered every Thursday before she became ill. The sight reminded me of someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Eleanor Pierce, Richard's former probate clerk. She retired shortly after my wife passed away. If anyone remembered how Richard organized client files before my hospital stay, it would probably be Eleanor. For the first time since leaving Richard's office, I stopped wondering whether the wrong military rank was merely the attorney's mistake. I started wondering whether it belonged to an entirely different file that had somehow found its way into mine. The easiest thing I could have done was accuse Richard Nolan of lying. Instead, I called his office the following morning and apologized. I'm embarrassed. Maybe my memory isn't as reliable as I thought. There was a short pause. Then his familiar confidence returned. These situations happen more often than people realize. I'm glad you're taking time to think. Exactly what I wanted him to believe. Air Force administration taught me that audits rarely begin with confrontation. They begin by allowing inaccurate records to continue moving until the pattern reveals itself. For the next several days, I became the uncertain client. When Richard left another voicemail asking whether I wanted to sign the revised will, I thanked him for his patience. When he offered to prepare final copies, I asked for another week. Each conversation ended with him sounding more relaxed than the last. He believed I doubted myself. That made him stop worrying about me. Instead of returning to his office, I drove to the public library where Eleanor Pierce volunteered twice each week organizing historical archives. She recognized me immediately. "Milton Graves? It's been too long." "It has." We sat beside a quiet reading room window overlooking the courthouse lawn. I carefully described the meeting with Richard. I mentioned only one specific detail. The document identified me as Major Milton Graves. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the table. Finally, she spoke. "Richard never used military titles in client files." "He didn't?" "No. He always copied exactly what appeared in the original engagement letters." That single sentence changed everything. If my title changed, then the source document changed first. She nodded slowly. I asked whether she remembered preparing my original estate file. "I do. My wife insisted every military record be absolutely accurate." I smiled. That sounds like her. Eleanor returned the smile for only a moment. Then her expression grew serious again. There was something else. "What?" "About 2 years before I retired, Richard stopped letting staff retrieve archived client folders. He did it himself." "Why?" "He said confidentiality required fewer people handling old records." Reasonable. On the surface. Until I remembered that Richard had given me exactly the same explanation when refusing to compare my original will. Different years, identical language. Leaving the library, I briefly convinced myself the answer was obvious. Perhaps Richard simply mixed 2 client files. Embarrassing, unprofessional, but not dishonest. For nearly an hour, I believed that explanation. Then Eleanor called my cell phone. I remembered another detail. "What is it?" There wasn't just one unusual file. There were several. "How many?" "I can't be certain. But I remember seeing correction slips attached to different estate folders." "What kind of corrections?" "Beneficiary pages." The words settled heavily in my mind. Not signatures. Not addresses. Beneficiaries. Driving home, I stopped beside the county archives building. The investigation had quietly changed direction. I no longer wondered whether my will had been confused with another client's paperwork. I began wondering how many families might still believe their loved ones intentionally changed beneficiaries when the documents themselves might never have reflected those wishes at all. Eleanor's final words stayed with me all weekend. Beneficiary pages, not signatures, not dates, not spelling corrections. The one section capable of quietly changing an entire family's future. By Monday morning, I no longer believed I was investigating one suspicious document. I was following a pattern. Air Force administration taught me another lesson during years of supervising personnel records. One mistake might be carelessness. Repeated mistakes using the same method usually indicate a system. The following morning, I drove to the county archives building. Most probate records remained confidential. Billing records, however, often created public filing trails. I wasn't looking for private estates. I was looking for timing. The archivist helped me locate Richard Nolan's publicly filed administrative indexes covering nearly 10 years. Nothing unusual appeared at first. Routine estate planning, trust amendments, annual reviews. Then one column caught my attention. Several elderly clients received unusually timed estate revision consultations within weeks of documented hospital admissions. Interesting. Not illegal. Not by itself. But the pattern repeated too consistently to ignore. 3 names. 5 names. Then 8. Every consultation occurred while the client was recovering from illness or surgery. Driving home, I kept reminding myself of one important rule. Patterns create questions. Evidence creates answers. That afternoon, Eleanor called again. I found something in my old storage boxes. What is it? My personal scheduling notebooks. You kept them? I never throw anything away. Neither did I. An hour later, we spread her notebooks across my dining room table. Each day listed appointments, filing deadlines, and archive retrieval requests. One notation immediately stood out. Original estate removed from archive. No reason. No destination. Only Richard's initials. Several weeks later, another note appeared. Return file after amendment. But no amendment should have existed, Eleanor whispered. Not according to the client meeting schedule. I carefully copied every date. The notebooks didn't reveal altered wills. They revealed something just as important. Certain original files repeatedly disappeared before clients officially requested revisions. The hidden mechanism had finally appeared. Late that afternoon, I visited the hospital records office again. This time, I wasn't asking about visitors. I requested confirmation of my admission and discharge dates. The records supervisor printed the timeline. Then she quietly frowned. Mr. Graves. Yes? You were transferred to rehabilitation the same morning your attorney claims you signed the revised will. I was? According to our records. That mattered. The rehabilitation facility operated nearly 40 miles away. If Richard claimed I signed the document in my hospital room that afternoon, the timeline simply could not exist as described. 3 independent systems now contradicted him. Hospital transfer records, visitor documentation, archive retrieval logs. Each piece stood alone. Together they began supporting one another. As evening settled outside my window, I opened the fountain pen case my wife had given me years earlier. The same pen rested beside every legitimate estate document we had ever signed together. I suddenly realized something I should have noticed days ago. Richard's revised will showed a scanned signature. Every authentic document my wife and I signed with that pen left a distinctive deep blue ink pattern that slightly feathered into the paper. The new document displayed perfectly uniform black lines. For the first time since Richard closed that folder in front of me, the central question changed completely. I stopped wondering whether my estate had been altered. I began wondering how many grieving families had already accepted similar documents, because no one had ever asked to compare them with the originals before they quietly disappeared. The deeper I looked into Richard Nolan's files, the less interested I became in protecting my own estate. My will could be corrected. Someone else's grief could not. That realization changed everything. For 40 years in Air Force administration, I believed every error deserved immediate correction. Retirement taught me a harder lesson. Sometimes correcting one mistake too early destroys the opportunity to uncover 10 others. On Tuesday morning, Eleanor called before sunrise. I found another notebook. What was in it? Client initials. Nothing more. No names, no addresses, just handwritten initials beside dates when original estate files had been removed from archive storage. We compared them with the public billing records I had copied the previous afternoon. The pattern repeated again. Every unexplained archive withdrawal occurred shortly before an elderly client's hospitalization or extended rehabilitation stay. One coincidence becomes interesting. 8 nearly identical timelines become evidence. That afternoon, Eleanor quietly admitted something she had struggled to say. I think I know one family. What do you mean? A widow. Her husband died about 5 years ago. I remember preparing their original trust. She hesitated. The beneficiary changed after his final hospitalization. Were you involved? No. Richard handled that file himself. I felt the weight of those words settle over the room. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, Eleanor whispered. She thanked Richard at the funeral. She believed he'd honored her husband's wishes. I closed my notebook. For the first time since this investigation began, the documents stopped feeling like paperwork. They became people. Late that afternoon, I drove to the county cemetery where my wife rested beneath a maple tree overlooking the Veterans Memorial Garden. I often brought fresh flowers. This visit felt different. The fountain pen she had given me rested inside my coat pocket. I sat quietly beside her headstone. If I stop now, I said the words aloud, our plans stay safe. The wind carried fallen leaves across the grass. But someone else's family may never know. The answer never came. It didn't have to. I already knew what she would have said. Protect everyone you reasonably can, not only yourself. Driving home, my cell phone rang. Richard, I've prepared revised appointment papers. We should finalize everything this Friday. Interesting. Not compare documents. Finalize them. I appreciate your patience, I replied. I've almost remembered everything. His voice relaxed. I'm glad to hear that. He believed uncertainty was slowly becoming agreement. Exactly the impression I wanted him to keep. That evening, Eleanor arrived carrying one final envelope. I almost forgot this. Inside rested an old office routing sheet. It documented every employee who handled archived files before permanent storage. Richard's signature appeared beside nearly every unexplained withdrawal. Then I noticed something else. The final column. Original returned. Several entries remained blank. The original files had been checked out. No documented return. The missing originals weren't simply difficult to locate. Some apparently never came back at all. For the first time since Richard refused to let me compare the wills, I realized the greatest danger was no longer proving my own document had been substituted. The real danger was that every day we waited, another family might unknowingly settle an estate without ever realizing the original wishes of someone they loved had quietly disappeared years earlier. Only 4 days remained before Richard Nolan expected me to return and sign the revised estate documents. By then, I understood something he clearly did not. I was no longer trying to save my own will. I was trying to preserve the evidence before anyone realized it existed. During my Air Force career, audits often reached a quiet turning point, not when the first discrepancy appeared. When separate records, created by unrelated people for unrelated reasons, began confirming one another without ever intending to. That was exactly where this investigation had arrived. Wednesday morning, Eleanor Pierce came to my house carrying a banker's box. I found the last files I kept after retirement. Inside were old office routing sheets, duplicate billing summaries, and handwritten archive logs she had been permitted to retain after confidential client information had been removed. No names remained, only dates. File numbers. Internal routing codes. Perfect. Personal identities weren't necessary anymore. The pattern was. We spread everything across my dining room table. The same table where my wife and I had signed our original trust with the blue fountain pen years earlier. One by one, we matched Eleanor's archive logs to the public billing records I had collected. Every unexplained file withdrawal aligned with an estate revision consultation. Every consultation aligned with a hospitalization, rehabilitation stay, or prolonged medical absence. Track A had quietly become Track B. The wrong military rank no longer proved only that my document looked suspicious. It now helped establish a broader administrative pattern showing that original files repeatedly disappeared before revised estate paperwork appeared. The contradiction had become evidence. Eleanor finally leaned back. This is enough. Enough for what? To make someone ask questions. That was all I wanted. Questions supported by documents, not accusations supported by emotion. Late that afternoon, Richard called again. I've reserved Friday morning. I appreciate that. I think we're almost finished. I think so too. He laughed softly. I'm glad you remembered. I looked at the fountain pen resting beside the evidence folder. No. I simply learned where to look. He assumed I meant my memory. I meant the paperwork. After we ended the call, I quietly visited Claire. My granddaughter greeted me with the same warm smile my wife used to wear. She noticed the banker's box in my hands. More old records? Just family history. She laughed. You always save everything. I hope you never stop teasing me about that. She helped me carry the box inside. Without realizing it, she asked the question I had avoided asking myself all week. Grandpa? Yes? If your lawyer really did something wrong, will other families get hurt? I didn't answer immediately, because I honestly didn't know. Finally, I said, they already may have. The room became very quiet. That single sentence settled the moral question I had been carrying since visiting my wife's grave. I could no longer solve only my own problem. Friday morning would become Richard's final opportunity to explain the missing originals before anyone outside his office reviewed the complete chronology. Whether he accepted that opportunity would determine what happened next. As I closed the evidence folder, I realized something that felt strangely peaceful. Justice no longer depended on convincing Richard to admit anything. The documents had finally learned how to speak for themselves. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and an unusually quiet mind. For the first time since Richard Nolan closed the folder in front of me, I wasn't wondering whether I could prove anything. The evidence had already answered that question. The only uncertainty left was whether Richard would choose honesty before someone else required it. The meeting took place in the same conference room where he had first presented the revised will. Nothing had changed. The same polished table, the same framed legal certificates, the same leather folder waiting neatly beside his chair. Only this time I carried my own folder. Inside were copies. Not accusations. Chronology. Eleanor Pierce sat beside me. At my request, she attended only as a witness to the sequence of records she had personally maintained during her years in the office. Richard greeted us with the same practiced smile. "Milton, I'm glad you remembered." "I did remember something." He nodded. "I thought you might." He opened the leather folder. "I've prepared the final documents." Before he could continue, I gently placed my evidence binder on the table. "I'd like to begin somewhere else." His smile faded only slightly. "Of course." I removed the first page, one of Richard's own letters from years earlier, addressed correctly. Lieutenant Colonel Milton Graves. Next came the revised will. Major Milton Graves. Then the hospital transfer record showing I had already been moved to a rehabilitation facility before the time he claimed I signed the document. Next came the visitor log. No attorney, no legal appointment. Then Eleanor quietly added the archive routing sheets. Original estate file removed. No documented return. Additional withdrawal. Another missing original. Then the public billing timeline. Hospitalization. Archive withdrawal. Estate consultation. Repeated again, and again, and again. No raised voices, no dramatic speeches, only documents arranged in the order they had been created. Richard looked down at the table. For nearly a full minute, no one spoke. Finally, he whispered, "This isn't what you think." I answered calmly. "Then help me understand." He looked toward Eleanor. "You kept those notes?" "I kept my work." Silence returned. Richard slowly removed his glasses. "I never intended—" He stopped. The sentence never finished, because intent no longer mattered. The chronology already existed. I slid one final document across the table. A list of estate files whose archive movements matched the same administrative pattern. No client names, only internal file numbers. Enough to begin an independent review without exposing private families. Richard closed his eyes. "How many people know?" "Eleanor. My granddaughter knows I've been reviewing paperwork. No one else." He looked genuinely surprised. "You didn't report me?" "Not yet." The room became completely still. "I wanted to give you the same opportunity I gave myself." "What opportunity?" "To tell the truth before someone else had to reconstruct it." For the first time since my wife entrusted our family's future to Richard Nolan, I saw something I never expected to see in his face. Not confidence, not denial, exhaustion. He quietly reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. "I've already drafted my resignation." Eleanor looked toward me. Neither of us spoke. Richard continued. "I'll cooperate with the review. I'll identify every file that needs independent verification." He lowered his head. "I can't undo the years. No. but perhaps I can stop another family from living through them. Walking out of the office, I realized something my wife used to say whenever difficult choices seemed impossible. The truth rarely raises its voice. It simply waits long enough for every lie to become too heavy to carry. 6 months later, the quietest sound in my house was the one I appreciated most. There was nothing left to hide. The independent review ordered by the state bar uncovered several estate files requiring careful verification. Some families learned that their original wishes had been accurately preserved. Others discovered administrative irregularities that demanded new hearings and corrected records. Every affected family received the opportunity to review authentic documentation before any future legal decisions moved forward. Justice did not erase grief, but it restored certainty. Richard Nolan surrendered his law license before formal disciplinary proceedings concluded. He cooperated fully with investigators, identified every file that required review, and accepted responsibility for the administrative failures documented during the investigation. No celebration followed. Only accountability. My own estate returned to exactly what my wife and I had created together years before. The Veterans Scholarship Foundation remained the primary beneficiary, just as we had always intended. One Saturday afternoon, my granddaughter Claire joined me in the study, where the cedar cabinet still held every family record. She smiled as I carefully returned the blue fountain pen to its velvet case. "You finally trust the paperwork again?" I looked around the room. "I trust the process. The paperwork still depends on the people protecting it." She nodded thoughtfully. Before leaving, she placed one new folder inside the cabinet. Across the front, she had written only 4 words. "Originals never leave home." I laughed. "That sounds exactly like something your grandmother would have said." Claire grinned. "I was hoping you'd notice." A small framed photograph now rests beside my wife's fountain pen. It shows the 2 of us outside the Air Force Chapel on the afternoon we signed our first will together. Whenever I look at it, I no longer think about the document Richard placed in front of me that morning. I think about the promise hidden inside every honest signature. A signature is never simply ink. It is trust given physical form. If this story reminded you that protecting a legacy requires more than faith in reputation, carry that lesson into your own family. Preserve original records. Ask respectful questions when something feels wrong, and remember that true loyalty is measured not by silent agreement, but by the courage to protect the truth for everyone who depends upon it. God bless every veteran, every family who honors the wishes of those they love, every honest professional who safeguards another person's trust, and every quiet guardian willing to let documented truth speak louder than comfortable assumptions.